Right, good evening. If you have a mobile phone, if you would like to put it on silent before it cooks something. Right, huge welcome back to Mark Devlin with Musical Truth. The music industry is organic, right? It follows its own rebellious paths, doesn't it? Encouraged by free-thinking record companies. Or maybe it doesn't. Mark Devlin, author, DJ and long-term member of the aforementioned industry, uncovers a sinister side to the popular music unknown to most. Under Mark's spotlight tonight, the clean-cut Beatles, the much less clean-cut Rolling Stones, mind-controlled artists, strange symbolism in pop videos, hip-hop, was John's favourite, trans-humanism, demonic possession, social engineering, and the government. They get everywhere, don't they? Please welcome Mark Devlin.
Thanks, Rob. Well, evening, folks. Good to be back. This is my third appearance at New Horizons, and this one is all about the tour to promote my book, as you just heard, which I didn't have out last time. It's been out for about 3 months now, and I'm currently doing a whole bunch of talks to present some of the material that's in the book. And it really will be only some of it, because this book is the culmination of 5 years worth of research, and it contains everything that I've come to realise over the past 5 years about the true nature of the corporate music industry and what it's used for and how it ties into the bigger picture of what's going on elsewhere in the world. So everything I know is between the covers of that book, although I have learned a few bits since. So I'm just going to go into some of the content of the book tonight, but there is a whole lot more. Rob just ran through some of the subjects there. It's all the good stuff, you know, demonic possession and mind control and satanic ritual abuse, all that family-friendly stuff, you know. I'm a bit knackered today, so I hope I'm coherent and I make sense. I just got in from Amsterdam earlier today. I've not been doing a tour of coffee shops. That's not really my thing. But I was out there for a conference, the Open Mind Conference Netherlands, which was really good. Great gathering. There's a lot more of these events springing up now in different countries. This one had Ian Crane speaking, Max Egan, Zen Gardner, Ole Damagard, Louise Sutton, and myself. And it was very similar to the Free Your Mind conference in the US, and it's great to see that these events are happening in Europe as well. So there was a whole bunch of subjects discussed, a whole load of action-based solutions at the end of it as well. So that was a great thing to be a part of. Unfortunately, I picked up a 4-hour delay on my flight coming home, and I had intended to go back and pick up a few more books to bring with me, and unfortunately I didn't get the chance to do that, so I had to come straight up to St Anne's tonight. So I've only got 7 books with me, but if anyone wants to grab one, I'll be doing that in the break, and if the 7 books go, then you can still get one from me by post afterwards. So this talk is a 2-parter, and in the first hour or so, I just want to present a few interesting little tidbits of information from the book. So it's a bit random, it's a bit disparate, but it will give you a flavour of some of the stuff that's in there. And then the second part of the talk is going to be a little more structured and themed. We're getting into some spiritual and metaphysical concepts, and I'm going to attempt to show how all of this fits together. I touched on some of this stuff in my talk last year, for anyone that caught that. I think that was June last year, and that's when I was first exploring these aspects of this tapestry of information. So we'll be going there in part 2. For part 1, for the last 2 talks that I've been doing, I've included a bit of stuff about Prince at the outset because it's still kind of topical, 1 month on in terms of what happened to Prince. And I think people have found it quite interesting to look at some of the unexplained aspects and unanswered questions and discrepancies when it comes to the official version of what we were told about Prince. So whenever we hear about the demise of a prominent artist like this, and it was just the same with David Bowie earlier in the year, there are always 3 options in terms of what we're really looking at. So option 1 is that everything happened exactly the way the mainstream media told us it did. And that would be a first, wouldn't it? So Usually you can throw that one out and consider it to be a crock of crap from the outset. The second option is that in some way Prince didn't actually die, and that his death was some kind of elaborate hoax, and that somehow he was able to slink off and live out his remaining years in anonymity, having retired the public persona. So that's always an option which is suggested in these instances. It certainly came up with Bowie. And then the third possibility is that he was got rid of, and he was offed by those forces that control the industry for one reason or another. So there's always these three options. It would probably become clear anyway, but my money is on option 3, which is that he was taken out in this particular instance. And we can get into some of the possible motives for why that might be as we go on. Just some Prince-related strangeness and weird stuff before we get into that. This is his Paisley Park complex just outside Minneapolis, and it's where his recording studio was housed. This is where he was said to have been discovered dead in the elevator, and he evidently spent a lot of time in this particular complex. Prince, as I'm sure you're aware, was always closely associated with the colour purple, and this complex was said to illuminate and glow in purple whenever he was present and on the premises. And if you look on the first part of the building there, on the top, we've got a pyramid with an illuminated capstone, which is kind of an interesting thing to have when we get into some of the symbolism and some of the related imagery as we go on. So there was lots of stuff in the news about the colour purple when we got the news of Prince's death. And as I'm sure you're aware, Prince's demise coincided with the 90th birthday of the Queen of Germany. England. I always... Betty Battenberg. So we had phenomena like the Niagara Falls on the US-Canada border being illuminated in purple. And there were a whole bunch of monuments around the world that were also illuminated in purple round about the 21st of April. And the Empire State Building was one of them. The story for this was that these monuments were being lit up in purple to mark the Queen's 90th birthday, which leaves us with the remarkable coincidence that an artist called Prince just happens to pass away on the day of the Queen's birthday, and of all the colours that they could have chosen to mark the occasion, they just happened to select purple. Now, I'm not aware of the Queen having been associated with the colour purple before this year at all. I might be wrong, but it's certainly not something that's come across my radar. So for some reason, purple was chosen to mark this occasion. This has inevitably led some researchers to suggest that, in fact, all these monuments being lit in purple was not so much to do with the Queen's birthday, that was the cover story, but it was all part of a ritual kind of ceremony to mark the passing of Prince. And this would support the theory that him being got rid of was something that was planned for quite some time in advance, because the logistics of setting up this light show at the Niagara Falls is something that would have taken a few days and would have taken quite a large team to get all this stuff in place in advance. So I was talking with somebody about this stuff a couple of weeks ago, and they told me that round about the time of the Queen's birthday, 21st of April, Green King, which is the largest pub chain in the UK, introduced a new brand of beer, and it was called Purple Rain. And it was rain as in R-E-I-G-N. And this person, I didn't see it myself, but this person told me that the brand was all associated with the colour purple, so they installed pumps into the pubs, which were purple, and you had beer mats and towels and posters and stuff, and it was all purple. So again, remarkable coincidence, at odds of several million to one probably, that this should just occur on this particular date. Other interesting stuff connected to the date on which we're told Prince passed, 21st of April. The period beginning round about the 19th, 20th of April and running all the way through to the 1st of May has always been a very significant period for dark occultists and satanic secret societies. This is something I got into with Freeman, the American researcher. I did a podcast with him straight after the news of Prince, and he raised this comment about the fact that this period from 19th to 20th of April all the way through to 1st of May is a period of sacrifice, which is associated with Beltane, the period known as Beltane, which culminates on the 1st of May. And there have been many events over the past years and decades that have occurred round about the 19th, 20th of April, bearing in mind that the Queen's birthday was celebrated on the 21st, and Prince is said to have passed away then as well. So we have things like the Oklahoma City bombing, the school shooting at Columbine, the Waco, Texas incident, and a whole load of others, in which, these all involved loss of life. So this would appear to be a period of sacrifice which is observed by the forces that control these industries and so much else. And it's kind of interesting when you factor in that element to this story. This guy is L.A. Reid, and he's part of L.A. Reid and Babyface, which is a production duo. They were very active in the late 80s and early 90s with a whole bunch of swing beat artists. They worked with the likes of Bobby Brown and Karen White and a whole load of others. I think he's now a judge on some TV talent show or something, but I avoid those things like the plague. I'm informed that he is, but I can't stand to watch these things. But anyway, the fact that he is demonstrates that he's completely owned by the industry and is, completely a stooge of it, albeit a high-ranking one. And he came out in an interview a couple of days after we got the news of Prince. You might recall that Prince had a very famous track, Let's Go Crazy. And at the start of the track, he's talking about, we ain't gonna let the elevator bring us down. Let's go crazy, punch a higher floor. The lyrics are connected with an elevator. And we got the news that Prince was discovered dead, in all places, in an elevator. So there's an interesting connection there. And this guy told the story that he knew Prince back in the day, and he was recounting this incident where Prince said to him, do you know what the elevator represents? And L.A. Reid said, no, what is it? And Prince is supposed to have said, it represents the devil. Which again is an interesting thing to consider when he was discovered dead in an elevator, we're told. And somebody emailed me after the podcast that I did, looking at the etymology of the word elevator and kind of breaking it down, and the fact that the first syllable of it is El, which is the Hebrew word for God, and that ties into Elohim and all kinds of other connotations. So there's probably a lot more to this whole concept of an elevator, and it would be no coincidence that we're told he was discovered dead in one. So nothing about the mainstream account of what happened to Prince adds up. Why would we be surprised? So first of all, we get the news that he died of the flu in a lift at the age of 57, like you do, happens all the time. Although Prince was a vegan and he was said to be in very good health, he worked out, he took care of his health, there are people that were at his concerts that he did in Australia just a few weeks before the news of his death, and they have said that he was leaping and jumping about the stage and he was full of energy and life and vitality, and he was acting like a man half his age. So he certainly didn't come across as someone who was about to croak it from the flu, So then, a couple of days after this, the mainstream account of things changes from he had the flu to, he was on a bunch of pharmaceutical medications, so that's probably what killed him. Similar to what we heard about Michael Jackson. But then that story changes. And then a few days later, the mainstream media are running with, Prince secretly had AIDS. Yeah, he had AIDS for 20 years, and nobody knew about it, and he kept it secret, and it finally caught up with him. So we got three conflicting stories in the mainstream straight away, and none of it adds up. As I say, there's always more questions than answers. So all this stuff does tend to support the theory that for whatever reason he was got rid of. And when it comes to what a reason or a motive for that might be, we've got some options. You might recall that Prince in the mid-90s famously fell out with his record company, Warner Brothers. And this is very reminiscent of what happened with Michael Jackson, with the Sony Corporation. And actually, when you get down to it, there's a lot of parallels between Michael Jackson and Prince. Both were born in 1958. Both of them had difficult childhoods and came from abusive kind of backgrounds. And both of them, through their careers, interestingly, displayed evidence of multiple personality disorder. or dissociative identity. So they each had alter egos. Prince, famously, he went by several different pseudonyms: Jamie Starr, Alexander Nevermind, Christopher Tracy, Camille, Cat. He used lots of alter egos. And when you see this with prominent artists in the industry, it can often hint at the presence of trauma-based mind control, monarch programming and such, which I'll get into big time in the book. Don't really have time to get into it in a big way tonight, but it's ever present in the corporate music industry. So lots of parallels there. And you've got the fact that Michael Jackson and Prince were both really big stars in the 1980s. They were kind of pitted against each other as rivals. It was like Prince versus Michael Jackson. And again, somebody pointed out to me, because since I've put this book out and since I've started doing these talks, my inbox fills up daily with messages from people that are bringing information across my radar, or they're picking up on something that I've said and they're saying, did you realise this? And here's a piece of research for you. So I get this stuff every day. You know, this stuff really is fascinating people and it's getting a lot of attention out there. So somebody brought to my attention the fact that if you look at the 1980s and if you consider who were the 4 biggest solo artists on the pop music scene coming out of the US in the 1980s, you would probably surmise that that would be Michael Jackson, Prince, Whitney Houston and Madonna. And out of those 4, 3 are gone. And we're left with Madonna, who is often referred to as the grand priestess of the industry. She does a lot of work for those that control these corporations. She's very much into Kabbalistic, Jewish Kabbalism and numerology and Freemasonic imagery and dark occult imagery generally, which appears in her stage shows and her videos and has done for a long time. So I would suggest that Madonna is still seen as a major asset to the industry, so they've kept her around, whereas the other 3, I would suggest, passed their sell-by date and kind of outstayed their welcome. And with each of those 3 artists, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston and Prince, we have lots of anomalies and discrepancies and lots of weird, unanswered stuff that just makes no sense when you really scrutinise it. So we can go into the fine detail of all of that, but it's a consistent factor with those 3 artists. So Prince, when he was having his dispute with Warner Brothers in the mid-90s, it was all over the nature of the publishing deal that he had with this label, and he was highlighting the nature of the deal that artists have with their corporations generally, which is an exploitative, oppressive one, which I'm sure most of us realise anyway. It's the same in the book game, actually, it turns out. So as part of this statement that he wished to make about the nature of these relationships, and there was also some legal grapplings over who would get to own Prince's master tapes, the master tapes of his back catalogue of albums. That became a major issue. And as part of his statement during this period, he adopted this symbol as his name, and so he renounced the artist name of Prince. So for a while, he preferred to be known as the artist formerly known as Prince, but there was a period where he wished to be known by this unpronounceable symbol. And when I did the podcast with Freeman, who is pretty much an expert on symbology and such, I asked him what the relevance was of this symbol. And his interpretation of it was that it represents the fusing of male and female elements, the sacred masculine, the sacred feminine. It's androgynous and it's a hermaphroditic type symbol. It's also got some connections into the Egyptian Ankh, symbol of life. And Prince, of course, peddled the androgynous image throughout his career, as did David Bowie, incidentally. And I've not uncovered any evidence of Prince having any homosexual affairs. He may well have done, but that's not come across my radar. On the contrary, though, he has been associated with some quite stunningly beautiful women over the years, and he was married twice as well. But whatever the case in his private life, as an artist, he chose to push androgyny. So he would often dress in a very effeminate manner, and he would often portray himself on track in that way as well. And that seems to have gotten a lot of female fans, because girls seem to like all that stuff in a male. But anyway, another way of Another statement that he chose to make when he was going up against Warner Brothers was that he took to having the word slave written across his face in concerts and in public appearances, such as this one here. This stuff, you can probably imagine, would probably not have gone down too well with the overlords at Warner Brothers Records. They don't tend to like artists breaking out and making these kind of expressions. Michael Jackson, just going back to him, fell out with Sony Corporation, you might say, when he got up at a public event, which was an Al Sharpton rally in 2002, and he described Sony as evil, and Sony's CEO, Tommy Mottola, as the devil. He didn't mince his words. And I can imagine that that probably got him struck off Sony's Christmas card list that year. And then, in terms of what might have been an ultimate motive to get rid of Prince, there are all kinds of comments that have been attributed to him in the days since we got the news of his death. So there's all these memes that have appeared on the internet, and there are quotes that he's supposed to have said in interviews over the years. I can't substantiate all of them, and it's not possible to pinpoint the actual interviews where he said a lot of these things. So some of them may have been fabricated because people seem to like doing that. They seem to get some kind of kick out of it. There are some things that we know he certainly did say, but there are others that are a bit more ambiguous. So this one emerged, and he's supposed to have said, "The genocidal Jews I've encountered in the music business are the reason that I never played Israel." Now, if he really did say that, you can imagine that it wouldn't have put him in great favour with those that control these industries. But one thing we know he did say, because you can still see the video on YouTube, and many people may have already done, is he went on a chat show hosted by Tavis Smiley in 2009, and spontaneously, out of nowhere, Prince started talking about chemtrails. And he was talking about how he had been studying the work of Dick Gregory, who's a long-standing black comedian in the US, turned activist. And Dick Gregory is in his 90s now, but he's still out there doing his thing, doing interviews and doing activism and stuff. And he's commented about all kinds of issues over the years, often to do with the treatment of black artists at the hands of white-controlled corporations. So Prince was starting to pay attention to some of the stuff that Dick Gregory was talking about. And he says that he first learned about chemtrails from listening to him. So on this chat show, he starts talking about the fact that all this crap is going on in the skies above our heads, and it's causing people to get ill, and he says it's causing people to kind of act crazy. So this would have been the first time that many mainstream audience people watching a chat show would have heard about chemtrails straight from Prince. And again, that's something that would have not put him in the greatest of favours with his overlords. So some of these run-ins that he had with Warner Brothers go back to the mid-90s. And I've had a whole bunch of discussions this weekend at the Open Mind Conference. And actually, any interview that I've done in the last month, and any conversation that I've had with anyone, the theme always gets round to Prince. And people always say, "What do you think about Prince?" And I've spent ages talking about it, many a conversation. And so when you raise the possibility that he was got rid of because he'd outstayed his welcome, he was becoming a loose cannon, he was becoming a bit unpredictable, and you point to these run-ins that he had with Warner Brothers in the mid-90s, people have said to me, but if he pissed Warner Brothers off in 1995, why did they wait until now to do away with him? And from what I've come to understand about the nature of those that control these industries and everything else, they display incredible levels of patience, and they play the long game. And when it comes to things like 9/11, for instance, there are many researchers who think that the decision to take down those towers in 2001 would have been made at the time that they were constructed, back in the 1960s. So, 30, 40 years before, these plans would have been set in place. And there's ample evidence to show that these individuals do plan years and decades in advance. So it's perfectly to me that if Prince pissed them off in the mid-90s, they could have borne that grudge and sat on it for 20 years before they chose to act on it. Also, it's my understanding that when they decide to take an artist out, there could be political reasons for it, there could be financial reasons for it, but they always do it in a ritualistic fashion in line with their dark occult belief systems when the time is deemed right. So bearing in mind what I was saying about how it coincided with the Queen's 90th birthday and how everything is steeped in ritualistic, ceremonial kind of magic with a K, all this stuff, to my mind, seems to come together. I think there's evidence to suggest that Prince may well have been a mind control subject, as I mentioned earlier, and certainly in the first half of his career, pretty much every track that he made was about sex, and he was really expressing that kinky, freaky kind of fantasy side of things. But certainly in the second half of his career, he started to make music that was much more reflective and mature and in some ways spiritual. And even in the days when he was making tracks about straight sex, usually on the same album, you could find another track that was more kind of redemptive and seeking to atone for these sexual sort of fantasies that he was exploring. This is something that came out on the second podcast that I did, where the guest pointed out some examples of these tracks on each one of his albums. So I think we had an individual who, towards the end of his life, as he matured, he seemed to regain some of his spirituality, and he came to some understandings about the true nature of this reality and who's running things, and some specifics like the chemtrailing agenda and such. And he strikes me as ultimately a conscientious individual that chose to try and put this information out to the world, whether it was in the odd interview or whether it was through his music. That would be another reason why he wouldn't be allowed to stick around, because we can go back to Michael Jackson. And most of Michael Jackson's tracks during the heyday of his career were about whatever, Thriller, Billie Jean, whatever. But towards the end, again, as he matured, as he got into middle age, as you're kind of supposed to in life, if you're still doing at 50 what you were doing at 30, you might have missed an opportunity along the way. So as these guys got older, they both tended to get a bit more reflective and a bit more spiritual, I would suggest. And there are Michael Jackson tracks like that as well. Not really my cup of tea musically, but I can certainly get with the message of some of these tracks. And both these artists are now departed. So, is that down to coincidence? Is that down to just one of those things, just the way it goes, dying of the flu at 57 in a lift? Or is there more to know here? So I'll leave you with that one. I didn't have time to put anything about Prince in the book because the book had been out a couple of months. When I got the news about David Bowie, my book was being typeset, and I asked the publisher if there was any opportunity to pull it back and just put a bit of stuff about Bowie in there. And I managed to get 5 pages in the book looking into some of the strange stuff about Bowie's reported death as well. So I was at least able to get some of that in the book. What I want to do now, just moving on from that, into the first part of this presentation, is to focus on some of the common themes and recurring elements which crop up time and time again in the backstory of the corporate music industry. And we're talking both the UK and the US industry, because a lot of the key stuff that was happening in one country or the other was actually reflected on the opposite side of the Atlantic. So we can see the same agendas being rolled out in both the British and the American scene. And again, I would ask, could that be down to random chance and coincidence and just the way it goes? Or does this hint at a formulated plan which goes right back to the very early days of the industry and which was playing out according to blueprints that had been set into place? So going right back to the 1950s, basically, and drawing on quite an eclectic array of resources, it became clear that there were some recurring elements that were popping up time and time again when you you lift the veil of the music industry and see what lies beneath. Some of them include trauma-based mind control, monarch programming, MK Ultra and such, satanic ritual abuse, paedophilia, or to call it what it really is, child rape. Let's call a spade a spade. Dark, occult, ritualistic ceremonies. A fascination with the occult teachings of Aleister Crowley and the various secret societies that he was a part of. What else? Lots of sirs. Never trust a sir. And lots of lords. When it comes to artists and those close to them, so that can be managers, loved ones, partners, a whole load of suicides and a whole load of accidental overdoses everywhere you look. Another factor in the British industry in the early days that cropped up time and time again was Jimmy Savile. A question which you might like to ask yourselves, which I ask at all my events, is what connection should there be between an industry that's supposed to be about entertainment, fun, forgetting all the stresses and strains of the working week and letting your hair down at the weekend and enjoying yourself and using your leisure time in a way that pleases you? What connection should there be between all of that and things like paedophilia, dark occult, Satanism, and all this stuff? There shouldn't really be any connections that you would expect to find, and yet we find them time and time again. So Jimmy Savile, we all know about him, no need to recap on him. I have to recap for US audiences because they don't really know too much about him, but I don't think it's necessary to do that in the UK. But it turns out that Jimmy Savile was associated with all the big movers and shakers in the early days of the industry. So here he is with very young Cliff Richard. There may well be more to say about Cliff Richard in future talks. We'll have to see how things pan out. Can't say too much at the moment, but I feel that as the year progresses, there may be more content regarding Cliff Richard that I can get into these talks. So here he is with Jimmy Savile, and Savile seems to be hypnotising him. Another theme which will crop up throughout this presentation is the concept of the truth of a matter being placed right there in plain sight, right in front of your face, for those with the eyes to see. I'm going to be getting more into why I feel that's being done in the second half, but the truth in plain sight is something that crops up time and time again as well. So here's Savile seemingly hypnotising Cliff Richard with a bloody pendulum. Here's Savile in rare dark hair mode with Paul McCartney. Or is it? We're not going there tonight. We're not doing Paul McCartney and we're not doing Flat Earth because we want to be out by 10 o'clock. So this was on the launch of the Sgt. Pepper album, and there's Savile with McCartney. So Savile was closely associated with the Beatles. For a period, he apparently went out on gigs with them and drove their van and humped their gear around, so he was basically a roadie for them for a short period. So very closely involved with them. Here he is with Mick Jagger. So connections between Savile and the Rolling Stones. Why would we be surprised? But this one does surprise people, particularly when I showed it in Free Your Mind in the US last month, because who knew that Savile even was in there with Elvis Presley? So a question that's been asked many times is, why does this sleazy, creepy, not particularly talented DJ keep cropping up with all these key movers and shakers, and why was he friends with senior politicians, and why was he mates with Prince Charles? And this is the question that's been asked so many times over the years, and Savile is key to so much of this because of what he represented and because of who he was doing the bidding for. So we're getting into the BBC, and Savile, of course, was very closely linked to the BBC, worked there for the best part of 50 years, and we hear that many of the kids that he sexually abused, it actually happened on BBC premises, paid for, of course, by licence fee payers, but Director General after Director General after Director General after Director General, decade after decade after decade after decade after decade, apparently didn't know it was going on, so it just got missed. It's just one of those things. Savile was knighted by the Queen. He joined Betty's Noncing Club, twice. But of course she didn't know anything about his background, and MI6 looked into it, but they couldn't find anything, again and again and again and again and again with paedophile after paedophile after paedophile after sir after sir after sir. But it's just one of those things, nothing to worry about, just slip through the net. That statue, by the way, sits outside Broadcasting House in London, which is the BBC's iconic building. And it's said to be from a Shakespeare play, Ariel and Prospero is the name of it. And people that appreciate art such as this and the works of Shakespeare and stuff point to this type of sculpture and they say, oh, well, it's art and it's expressing this or whatever. But I kind of call it as I see it, and what I see is a male adult with a young naked male child writhing against his crotch. And given what we've come to understand about the true nature of the BBC and the stuff that goes on there and the people that they employ, it's kind of an interesting statue to have outside their building. So for many years, Savile was actually the public face of BBC's Children in Need, incredibly. So the annual money grab, where the BBC implores the public to please dig deep and give us your money because we don't have enough. We've got to help these poor kids in needy situations, give whatever you can. And they actually put Savile out there saying, come on, give us what money you can. And I can't help thinking that there would have been far fewer children in need if it hadn't been for the BBC. So the hypocrisy of them, first of all, having an annual money grab and saying, come on, we've got to help these poor kids, we care about them. And then putting a serial paedophile on display as the public face of this programme is monumentally taking the piss. It is placing the truth in plain sight, but it's also mocking the general public, who, until recent years, would have had no idea that all this stuff was going on. They really were blatantly mocking us with a very macabre, twisted sense of humour. Pudsey Bear is the emblem of the BBC's Children in Need. I've got a lot of stuff in the book about symbolism, and particularly symbols that are employed to hint at the presence of mind control, trauma-based mind control, and satanic ritual abuse, generational satanic ritual abuse, where they take kids from specific bloodlines that are deemed important, and from a age they subject them to horrific traumas, which causes the mind to disassociate from reality, and the different personalities that are created can then be programmed with different personalities which are brought out at will. So again, there's more on how that all plays out in the book as well, which I don't really have time to get into now. But there are many symbols which pertain to the presence of this method of mind control. And one of them is a teddy bear. And it's often teddy bears that are pictured with broken limbs. So it could be an eye missing, it could be an arm, it could be a leg. You get the same thing with dolls, where you get dolls with broken arms. Same thing with shattered mirrors. And all of this is designed to symbolise the shattered innocence of childhood that these subjects experience at the hands of the perpetrators. So when you learn to spot all the signs and symbols, they kind of leap out at you when you see them. And one of them, as I said, is a teddy bear. Often teddy bears with eyes missing, and in this case we've got one eye covered up, which also ties into some interesting symbology regarding little calling cards and little motifs that those that control these industries like to place in plain sight. Again, you see the covering of one eye all the time. So isn't it interesting that we have Pudsey Bear, and part of the emblem is just that. And also, he's sitting inside a pyramid in the early version, which is another interesting symbol. So, Savile wasn't the only grotesque paedophile to have been wheeled out by BBC Children in Need. Gary Glitter here got in on the act, so they wheeled him out as well. There's sickening footage of Gary Glitter guesting on one of Jimmy Savile's shows on the BBC, where they're both sitting on a sofa and they're inviting kids up to come and sit on their knees. Here's Rolf Harris on stage with Pudsey Bear. And there were many others as well. So that's just connections into the BBC. Ultimately, everything is connected, really. Everything feeds into everything else, and you just realise that it's a tapestry of information that overlaps and kind of coincides at every turn. And there's all these kind of synchronistic links between key players and prominent figures. So we're back to a young Cliff Richard, and one of his associates in his early days was this guy, Lord Boothby. I told you there'd be a few lords. Bob Boothby. Anyone that's seen the recent movie Legend about the Cray twins, where Tom Hardy plays both brothers, Bob Boothby is portrayed in that movie in a not particularly flattering way. So Cliff Richard, it's on public record that he was, associated with them. The nature of their relationship is open to debate, but you probably also heard that Cliff Richard has been implicated with the Elm Guest House in London, and his name appeared on a list of famous celebrities that are said to have attended that particular place. So here are the Cray twins. Most folk in the US don't tend to know who these guys are either. They know all about the Manson murders, but they don't really know about the Crays. So I usually spend a bit of time explaining the Crays to an overseas audience. But the official version that we have of the Crays, or the Wikipedia version, is that they were these East End gangsters, and they were into various criminal activities, running drugs and laundering money and beating people up and then ultimately murdering people. But there's another aspect to their activities which many researchers have uncovered, which you don't tend to hear about in official biographies and on Wikipedia. And this is the very strong suggestion that the Crays were actually involved in procuring children from care homes for use in these VIP elite paedophile rings. That was a part of their service. And all the other criminal stuff was kind of a smokescreen to conceal this aspect of their activities. So the Crays, it turns out, knew Cliff Richard, and the Crays were tied in with many prominent politicians of the day, and there's connections into the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. And again, you can ask yourself, why should this be? But as I say, there's overlapping kind of correlations everywhere. And some researchers have even speculated on whether the Cray twins could have been subjects of mind control themselves, given that, particularly with Ronnie Cray, his mood would often change from peaceful and placid and urbane to violent and psychopathic at the drop of a hat, which is very endemic of the presence of mind control. And often in mind control experiments, twins are used and have been historically, going right back to the Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele. And a lot of the experiments that he did in the concentration camps in the Second World War were on twins, because he wanted to see whether the twins could disassociate and kind of take over each other's persona. So it's all deeply sick stuff, but twins were often favoured in mind control experiments, so it makes you wonder. Then this fella crops up everywhere as well, Aleister Crowley, as I mentioned, and the various teachings and ceremonial ritual magic stuff that he espoused has been very much revered by many prominent musicians, as I've mentioned in previous talks. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, Elton John, even going through to Hall & Oates. Daryl Hall, of all people, has expressed how fascinated he's been by the works of Aleister Crowley, and he said that he sees himself as a latter-day kind of expression of Crowley, and then going through to Jay-Z as well. So Crowley's work pops up everywhere. Here he is on the cover of the Beatles' iconic Sgt. Pepper album, in among their heroes. And here's Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, outside Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland, which was once owned by Crowley. And Crowley lived there himself for a period in the early 1900s. He's said to have conducted various rituals and seances there, and he's said to have brought through demonic entities from other realms through these rituals that he was performing. So it's not the sort of place that I would choose to spend a night. Jimmy Page lived there for 20 years. He bought the house in 1971 when he got the opportunity, and he sold it in 1991 and reportedly spent many a night there, so rather him than me. And all kinds of stuff has been said to have manifested there. And actually Boleskine House last year, I believe it was, burnt to the ground. Just unexpectedly. I don't really know what the details were, but it was just seen to be in flames, and it just got engulfed, and that's the end of that, whatever the reason might be for it. So then the Rolling Stones, not to be outdone by the Beatles and all the kind of occultic, esoteric stuff they were into, are every bit as fascinating when you come to study the finer detail of them. This was a very interestingly titled album called Their Satanic Majesty's Request, and the cover design was a bit of a pastiche on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. It looks quite similar in many ways. So you've got Saturn in the top of the picture there, a blood red Saturn, and you've got Mick Jagger with his wizard's hat and stuff, and they're all decked out in this strange regalia. And one of the most famous tracks by the Rolling Stones, of course, is Sympathy for the Devil. So we have, their Satanic Majesties, Sympathy for the Devil, and there's all kinds of other stuff hinting at a fascination with the dark occult when it comes to this group as well. Sudden death is an aspect that seems to have followed the Rolling Stones around through the decades, and there are various examples of it. So there was this famous concert that they performed at Altamont, the Altamont racetrack near San Francisco in December 1967. And the group are up there on stage, and it's gone down in rock music mythology that they were performing the track Sympathy for the Devil at the time this event happened. But it turns out they'd just finished that track and moved on to the next one. But nevertheless, you had this young lad in the audience that you can see in the green jacket there, a young black guy, 18 years of age, by the name of Meredith Hunter. And while the group were performing, with Hell's Angels doing the security, and not a great job of it, it would seem, this young lad got stabbed to death right in front of the stage with the group continuing to perform. So this has led many, understandably, to question whether that event was pre-planned as some kind of ritual sacrifice, because it turns out, unfortunately, that from time to time this sort of thing does go on. And there have been many examples of events which many have pointed to as massive ritual exchanges of energy, in line with their belief systems. So this happened in 1967, and it was a real blemish on the image of the Rolling Stones at the time, for obvious reasons. The Rolling Stones were very closely associated with a filmmaker by the name of Kenneth Anger, and his speciality was very short little montages of very striking images. And he was a Satanist, openly, and quite proud of it, made no bones about it. And he was into homoeroticism, and so a lot of this imagery made it into his films. His two most famous little montages of images were entitled Lucifer Rising, and this is a still from Lucifer Rising featuring Marianne Faithfull, who was a bit of a Rolling Stones kind of groupie, closely associated with the group, but nobody really knew what her role was. And there was another girl called Anita Pallenberg that was in pretty much the same category. So she was featured in this movie in this very striking scene in front of the Great Pyramid in Egypt, depicting the goddess Lilith, and this was kind of typical of the sort of stuff that Kenneth Anger put out. His other most famous film was called Invocation of My Demon Brother, and Mick Jagger was involved in the soundtrack for Demon Brother, and also Lucifer Rising. And Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin was very closely associated with the Rolling Stones in their early days as well. They met through a guy called Alexis Corner, who was responsible for bringing together many of those key groups at the time. So Jimmy Page was brought in to produce the soundtrack for Anger's Lucifer Rising. The film wasn't released until many years after it was produced, but Jimmy Page's version of the soundtrack was eventually dumped in favour of one that was put together by a guy called Bobby Beausoleil. And Bobby Beausoleil was one of Charles Manson's associates or disciples, part of that whole Manson family. And Beausoleil got a life imprisonment term for torturing and murdering a music teacher by the name of Gary Hinman. And he actually composed the soundtrack to Lucifer Rising, the one that was eventually used, from his jail cell. So of all the people that could have been used, for some reason it had to be Bobby Beausoleil that Kenneth Anger went to produce this soundtrack. So that was the history behind that. Bobby Beausoleil in turn was closely associated with an organisation known as the Process Church of the Final Judgment, operating out of San Francisco. And this would appear to be a cult, and it was steeped in satanic activity and such. That, in turn, was associated with another organisation known as the Church of Satan, run by its high priest Anton LaVey. And then you've got some other connections into the Process Church. One of them is David Berkowitz, who was the son of Sam, serial killer, was a part of the Process Church as well. And according to information that was given to me by Ed Opperman, who's a private investigator from the United States, I guested on his radio recently, Sirhan Sirhan, who is said to be Bobby Kennedy's killer, was also seen attending Process Church meetings. So straight away, you've now got connections from the music industry into the satanic film industry, into ritual cults, into serial killers, and into all manner of stuff that you might expect not to be there, but it is anyway. The 1960s, and particularly the second half of it, is a truly fascinating period with so many synchronistic connections. So just sticking with the Rolling Stones and this concept of death coming out of nowhere, the founder member of the Stones was actually Brian Jones, and he was discovered dead face down in the swimming pool of his country house in Sussex on the 3rd of July 1969. And the house was originally owned by A.A. Milne, apparently, who was the creator of Winnie the Pooh and is said to have been a paedophile, but I'm sure it's just a coincidence. So we have Brian Jones face down in his swimming pool and discovered on the 3rd of July 1969. And this occurred 2 years to the day before we get the news of Jim Morrison being discovered unconscious in a bathtub in his apartment in Paris. So 3rd of July 1969, 3rd of July 1971. Both of these guys were 27 at the time of their death, or their reported death. And this brings in the 27 Club, which a lot of people are familiar with. This is the large, unfeasibly large number of prominent musicians that have died at the age of 27 in some circumstance or other. So Brian Jones is in that number, as is Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, a guy known as Pigpen out of the Grateful Dead, a blues musician Robert Johnson, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, and probably a whole bunch of others that I've forgotten. But the 27 Club has quite a few members. So Brian Jones was an early one. And I've just put this one as an interesting aside. There was a high-profile court case involving a drugs bust of Brian Jones, and it occurred at exactly the same time as Mick Jagger and Keith Richards got done in another drugs bust in a separate location, so it kind of hints at a sting operation. But nevertheless, when Brian Jones was leaving the court in connection with this case, he left in a car which has a very interesting number at the end of the registration plate, which you can see in the top right there. The number is 666, and it's not the last time we'll be encountering that particular number. And just some other interesting stuff involving Brian Jones. One thing that we're going to get into as we progress, which is another recurring theme in this whole story, is the unfeasibly large number of connections between prominent music makers and military intelligence operations, whether it's the CIA, the FBI, MI5, MI6, the Pentagon, various aspects of the military. There are so many examples of family connections into these institutions that it goes way beyond the realms of chance. And if you chalk it up as just a coincidence, we're looking at odds of many, many millions to one, I would suggest, in the overall picture. So why should it be that there are so many family connections, invariably through the fathers of these musicians, into these type of institutions? So with Brian Jones, his family came from Wales and they relocated to Cheltenham, and his father was employed as an aeronautics engineer for the Defence Department of the British government at the time. And Cheltenham became the headquarters of GCHQ, Government Communication Headquarters, like the UK's version of the NSA, all concerned with spying and surveillance. This is the GCHQ building in Cheltenham. And when you get into some of the symbolism surrounding Saturn and the dark influence of the planet Saturn, which seems to be key to understanding why so many of these symbols are used, it gets interesting to look at the layout of this building because there's lots of Saturnic symbolism being employed there. An interesting little story which I picked up from the late Dave McGowan, who was an author and researcher who did a lot of work into exposing these connections between prominent music artists and military intelligence, specifically his work on the artist that came out of Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles, as we'll get to. But I heard him on a radio interview a short while before he unfortunately passed away on the 22nd of November last year, which is the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and is an interesting date for a conspiracy researcher to leave this realm. But anyway, Dave McGowan had cancer and he, we're told, succumbed to it on that particular day. Yeah. So I picked up this story from him, and it concerns a long-time career CIA guy by the name of Miles Copeland. Miles Copeland had 3 sons. One of them he called Miles Copeland Jr. They're not particularly imaginative with their names, are they, Americans? So this is him, this is Miles Copeland Jr. And he started a company, a music industry company, called International Record Syndicate. So the initials were IRS, and you can see it on his t-shirt there. And then there was another brother, what was his name? Ian Copeland. And he started a management company, music management company. And the initials of the company break down as FBI. And then the third son was Stuart Copeland of the group The Police. So you have a CIA guy with 3 sons who start companies called IRS, FBI, and a group called The Police. And bearing in mind, we're talking about the concept of placing the truth in plain sight, plus the concept of taking the piss. I would suggest both those elements are at work here. That's a real fascinating little story. So this is Dave McGowan, and this is his landmark book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And he broke the revelation of the fact that pretty much all of the prominent artists in the counterculture scene, which was known as the hippie scene, that came out of California in the mid to late 1960s, in almost every case, when you look at the backgrounds of the fathers of these musicians, there are connections back into military intelligence pretty much each and every time. And this is the case with all of the musicians that kind of shaped and moulded that folk rock scene that really changed the landscape of music at that time. And this was happening in tandem with music that was changing back over in the UK. As I said, a lot of this stuff was happening parallel on both sides of the Atlantic. So in the second half of the 60s, over here, you had music such as the Beatles really changing big time, around about 1966. The music they made post-66 is radically different from what they did before. And then you had a lot of psychedelic, experimental kind of music coming out of the UK. Pink Floyd, when they first started up, were very much on that psychedelic tip, as were Status Quo initially, and many other groups. And then back over in the States, you had this whole scene coming through, and it was tied in with so many other social changes that were happening at the time as well. I think we'll probably pause here then for the break. There's lots more to come in part 2. I've got some copies of the book over there if anyone wants to buy one. But other than that, I'll see you in about 15-20 minutes and we'll go into the rest. Thanks.
So, I'll pass you over when he comes back. He's having a drink. Oh, he's here.
I thought you knew.
Part 2, Mark, thank you.
Yeah, pantomime season comes early. He's behind you. So, as we progress, I want to get into these concepts of, again, placing the truth in plain sight, and we're going to get into free will consciousness and consent, which are subjects that I discussed last time, actually, in my talk last year, and that was the first public talk that I'd done, bringing in those elements. So, New Horizons broke all that for me. But before we get there, just continuing with what we were talking about before the break, and specifically this scene that came out of Laurel Canyon, which was known as the hippie scene, and the work of Dave McGowan, which showed that all these prominent musicians had families in military intelligence. The classic example, which I always show, but which I think bears repeating because it makes the point so well, is that of Jim Morrison of The Doors. And this is a rare picture from January 1964 with a young Jim Morrison looking very different to the iconic rock hero image that we're all used to, on the bridge of his father's ship. And his father there was a naval commander, Admiral George Stephen Morrison. There he is. And as McGowan related in his book, and as he dug out through his research in 2008, which is the first time this story had been told in 40 years. It's missing from all official biographies of Jim Morrison, and you don't find it on Wikipedia either. But McGowan demonstrated that Jim Morrison's father just happened to be the naval commander in charge of the fleet of ships that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was actually a false flag when you get down to it, but it was used to springboard America into the Vietnam War, effectively. So you have this iconic rock god whose image was all about rebellion and angst and, you know, going against the system, and he was a poster boy for the anti-war crowd at the tail end of the 1960s, and his dad basically started the Vietnam War. How do you reconcile these two elements? So with the whole Laurel Canyon crowd, McGowan showed that the fathers were always connected back into the CIA or the military or, you know, the FBI or the Pentagon or the Defense Department or whatever. So Frank Zappa was another of the artists that came out of that scene. But this weekend, I was at the Open Mind Conference in the Netherlands, and I was spending a lot of time with Max Egan. People might be familiar with Max. Yeah, great guy, quite a character. And Max is a musician, and he's a big fan of Frank Zappa. And he was aware of this element of, you know, what McGowan spoke about and what goes into my book. And he insists that Zappa was not a willing participant in this whole scene in the way that many of the other musicians would have been. And he points to the lyrics of his songs, and he points to the comments that he made in interviews all the way up to his death at the age of 52, kind of early, of prostate cancer. And, you know, Max was playing me examples of songs and showing me examples of some of the stuff that this guy said, which all point to the suggestion that he was a very consciously aware, intelligent individual, and that, you know, he was not happy about that aspect of his background, which was the fact that his father was involved in chemical weapons research. He was a bioweapons engineer working out of the Edgewood Arsenal military base. And so many other people actually have said that they don't feel Frank Zappa was willingly a part of that whole scene. And he spent his career kind of rebelling against it and trying to speak truth and trying to wake the American public out of their mind-controlled slumbers. So that may well be the case with Frank Zappa, and I'm prepared to be and happy to be, put straight on that one. But when it comes to all the other artists out of that community, they all flocked to Laurel Canyon from so many other areas of the US and also Canada and in some cases the UK. And there was something about that small neighbourhood in the Hollywood Hills that drew all these people in. and it turns out to have been the home of a covert military research base, which was proving to be the attraction for all these artists being brought in. So the implication of all of this is that this scene that for so long has been thought of as being organic and being the result of the youthful generation of that time wanting to express themselves creatively, and it's supposed to have just come organically and grassroots, in actual fact was cynically manufactured and concocted by various aspects of military intelligence. There are links back to the CIA wherever you look. And what supports the theory that that whole scene was not natural and was actually designed to do a number on an entire generation. And this would be the generation that's known as the baby boomers, that were born at the tail end of the Second World War. And they were coming of age in the mid to late 1960s. And it would seem that the dark controllers had that particular generation in their crosshairs in terms of wanting to mind control them, socially engineer them, and steer them culturally in a certain direction rather than allowing things to take a natural course. And some of the other evidence we have to support that hypothesis is the fact that all this music, when it started to change and become psychedelic and experimental, coincided with the arrival of LSD on the scene. And you had characters like Dr. Timothy Leary, who was a kind of self-styled acid guru, this cool, groovy college professor that arrived on the scene and started advocating the use of LSD so that young people could explore their consciousness and go on these amazing journeys and listen to in tandem with the music. It was supposed to be, taking you somewhere. Turn on, tune in, drop out was the mantra of the time. And then you had other characters like Ken Kesey, who was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the original novel on which the later film starring Jack Nicholson was based. And Ken Kesey was a mind control subject himself, it would seem, and he was a CIA asset. Timothy Leary, in his later years, admitted to having been a CIA asset. So, as well as Leary giving out free tabs of acid, you also had Ken Kesey and this group of associates that he referred to as the Merry Pranksters. And they used to go around the US and particularly California, Haight-Ashbury and San Francisco, in a brightly coloured psychedelic bus, which puts me in mind of the bus that the kids went around in Scooby-Doo. So Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters were distributing free acid, and they were giving out drinks like Kool-Aid laced with acid. And this stuff, by all accounts, is quite expensive to produce. So you've got to wonder how guys like Ken Kesey were able to get an endless supply of it to give out to all these kids that were tripping out to this amazing music at that time. So there's CIA connections there. Round about the same time, you had this guy called Gordon Wasson, who was also connected to the CIA, and he did a lot of research into the mind-altering effects of magic mushrooms. Went down to Mexico on a famous trip, which was later proved to have been funded and commissioned by the CIA to, it's basically a research trip to investigate the mind-altering effects of particular brands of mushrooms. And this stuff was put on the market at the same time as LSD. There's a lot of great work into this by a guy called Jan Irvin, who runs a website called Gnostic Media. He's done hours and hours and hours of interviews looking into the whole era, the hippie era, the connections back into the CIA, LSD, the music, how it all ties together. Really fascinating stuff for anyone that really wants to delve into this whole subject area a lot further. The reason I find this particular period so fascinating is because, like I said, there are so many elements of it that all synchronistically tie together. Another thing that was going on at the time, which I alluded to earlier, was the Manson family murders that all came to a head in August 1969 with the infamous Tate LaBianca murders. And this was a few days before the famous Woodstock Festival, also in August 1969, another very iconic event of that whole era. As I mentioned earlier, there were connections into this shady kind of process church of the Final Judgment organisation. There were links also into the Church of Satan, which was founded by its high priest, the very charismatic Anton LaVey, in 1966. And there's something about that year, 1966, when a lot of stuff started to change and a lot of aspects of this story seem to be centered around 66. The dark controllers that we're talking about, this dark occult religious priest class that are running these institutions, are obsessed with their ritual practices, they're obsessed with their symbolism, and they're also into numerology, and numbers figure big time in their belief systems. So you've got to wonder whether with 1966, what we're looking at is another kind of expression of the 666, this number which is connected with Saturn, and it's the number of the beast in the book of Revelation, and it's a number which is very much revered by these satanic societies. So, for instance, you could turn the 9 upside down to form another 6, and then you've got the 666. But either way, a lot of stuff was happening. Not least, I said I wouldn't mention it, but I'm only giving it lip service, the theory of the replacement of Paul McCartney. Paul is dead. There are said to be a lot of visual clues in Beatles album sleeves and a whole load of clues in the Beatles music pertaining to this idea that the original McCartney was replaced. As I say, I'm not going to go into it big time in this talk. I have done in previous ones, but I'll leave you with the question of whether that is two pictures of the same individual or whether we're looking at two different people. You can judge for yourself. But either way, the idea that McCartney was replaced all centres around 1966. And the date that is given by many researchers into this area is 9/11 of 66. And depending on which researcher you speak to, that's expressed as either September the 11th of 1966 or the 9th of November, which is the British way of expressing that date, also in 1966. It's all focused around that year, and incidentally, when it comes to September 11th, 9/11, there are so many synchronicities tying into the Beatles and various aspects of them. Some of them are listed in the book. There are other researchers whose work you can find online where they go into the synchronicities of September 11th in various years going into the Beatles. There's so much stuff going on beneath the surface that most people have no idea of. And if numerology and symbology fascinates you, then you can be stuck with the Beatles and with so many other acts of that era for days, just looking at how it all ties together. There's a couple of movies that I generally mention when I'm on the subject of 1966 and everything that was happening, all these social changes that were occurring in that period. This one is Rosemary's Baby, which is an amazing movie directed by Roman Polanski, who's a Satanist and a paedophile, but I'm sure it's just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. Just the man for the job. So we have some interesting imagery here in one of the poster designs for Rosemary's Baby. This absolutely smacks of mind control, again going back to dissociative identity and multiple personality disorders and satanic ritual abuse. It is an amazing movie to get into because I believe that it's one of many aspects in Hollywood movies of, again, the truth being placed right there in plain sight. So the narrative is all about a group of Satanists, a network of Satanists operating out of this building, interestingly, which is the Dakota Building in New York, outside which John Lennon was assassinated in December 1980. So the story of Rosemary's Baby takes place inside this building. Many synchronicities tying Roman Polanski, Rosemary's Baby, Mia Farrow in with the Beatles. I think I went into this in one of my previous talks here, but again, stuff you can get lost in for days. So the narrative of this movie has this network of Satanists, but they maintain very convincing and very benign seeming covers. So it's the dear sweet old couple in the building that are the neighbours of the Mia Farrow and her husband. And there's the family doctor and there's family friends and stuff. And on the surface, you would never imagine that they're into Satanism, but beneath the surface, it turns out that they are. And I would suggest that this is giving you a little indication of what really goes on in human society, where there's a whole bunch of people in certain walks of life that are connected into satanic activity, and you would never think so from looking at their public personas. Another interesting image connected to Rosemary's Baby was this one with the covering of one eye. So the interesting thing about it is this movie was released in 1968, but it was set in 1966. And we know this because one of the lead Satanist characters points to a calendar which is on the wall, and it's a 1966 calendar. And he says, this is year one. Everything starts in 66. And bearing in mind, 66 was the year that Anton LaVey established the Church of Satan. So there's all kinds of connections back into that year. Then we have another movie that was released in 1968, but production on it was taking place in 66. And it's Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, mind-blowing piece of work, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Amazingly enigmatic film that, again, you can study for days, certainly one of my all-time favourites. And I mused for a very long time over why, of all the years that could have been chosen by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke to set this futuristic space epic in, 2001 was the one that was chosen over 2000, maybe the start of a new millennium, or any other number you might have settled on. So tying in again with 66 and going forward to 2001, in 1966 construction started on the World Trade Center South Tower in New York. So this was occurring at the same time that this movie was being produced. And did anything happen in 2001? Can anyone? Oh yeah, of course. There was this. So we had the events of 9/11, 35 years later. And as I mentioned earlier, the controllers that we're talking about here play the long game, and they display incredible levels of patience in terms of getting the job done. And there is ample evidence to show that the events of September 11th, 2001 were planned way back in the 1960s, as many researchers have demonstrated. So we're into the realms of predictive programming here, which I got into in my talk last year and gave many examples of it. And it's the foreshadowing of a real-world event which is yet to occur, which is encoded cryptically into works of popular culture. It's movies, it's TV shows, it's cartoons, it's music videos, it's record sleeves. And as I've demonstrated before, there are literally hundreds of examples of the events of 9/11 in 2001 being depicted in all these works in the years leading up to it. Here's a montage of many of them. Here's where we get into, again, placing the truth right there in plain sight, and the necessity that those running the show seem to feel towards conveying what they're up to, what they plan to do, and what their true nature is. There's got to be a reason why they do this, because they invest a lot into it. The logistics involved in getting these scenes into these movies and cartoons and just directing all of these things is colossal. And the amount of money and time and energy that is expended on it is pretty monumental. So there's got to be a very good reason as to why they feel the need to do this in line with their dark belief systems. We'll get onto it. So another thing which I focused on previously and which bears a recap is many of these favoured signs and symbols that we see familiar music artists throwing up at every available opportunity. So just whipping through a few popular ones here, we have this thing going on the whole time with the hands. There's a young Michael Jackson doing it. There's a latter-day Beyonce doing it. Here's a whole bunch of others doing it as well. You might recognise a few of them. The Pope one is fake, unfortunately, but the others are genuine. And there's a few others. So this is what's going on. It's another representation of the 666. This is supposed to be one of the sixes, and you have the three fingers denoting the three sixes. All of these signs and symbols, as I mentioned before, come with their innocent, plausible deniability. So this is supposed to mean, okay, everything's cool. And it's incredible, when you learn to spot these symbols, the minute you get them into your conscious mind and out of the subconscious, which is where they're aimed at, you start to notice them everywhere. But this is the way it's written off. It's supposed to mean, yeah, cool, okay, you know. But when it comes to those in the know, and when it comes to these networks and these groups that are connected to the entertainment industry, this becomes a method of communication. And it's, you know, from one to another to just let you know what they're a part of and the fact that they're one of the gang. Here's Dr. Dre's headphones range called Beats by Dre. It's made him a very rich man. And we have this advertising literature with what purports to be 3 B's for Beats, but in actual fact it turns out to be 3 6's because Dr. Dre is a part of, you know, the same network. That's why he's successful. That's why he's achieved great fame and fortune. If he wasn't signed up with the gang, he wouldn't be up there at the top levels, because it becomes clear that if you are a major celebrity that everyone's heard of, if you're a household name, if you're earning mega bucks, if you're in the $20 million club and above, you will have paid a price to get there. This stuff doesn't happen by accident. Groups and musicians don't become that successful by chance. It's not some random thing. Those that industries can make anything happen that they want, and so the acts that you see at the very top of the game are the ones that have been chosen for the position. So they're selected and they're placed there. Here's some advertising literature for Drake. This is for one of his recent releases. 2 symbols for the price of 1. You've got the 6 with the all-seeing eye within it. Here's the devil horns that we see a lot as well. And this one comes with the cover story that it's deaf sign language for I love you, when the thumb is extended like that. It's supposed to be an I and an L and a U. We see people doing it all the time, such as, you know, these lovely heartwarming people, because they're just the type to say I love you, aren't they?
I can feel the love.
Yep. I can feel the humanity. So, yeah, what's really going on here is something rather different. Here's Eminem doing the same symbol, and it is what's known as the devil horns or the horned hand, and it's tied in with the reverence that these networks and these individuals have for this entity known as Baphomet, which is a bit of a kind of sigil and calling card associated with Satanism and various dark occult practices. And it's another way of them just letting you know who they are, what they're a part of, and who they really serve. Another one is this, popularised by Jay-Z, and we see Kanye West in what appears to be a mind-controlled state with a great big bloody teddy bear behind him, doing the same thing. So this is said to be the rock sign by Jay-Z, and it's supposed to symbolise his record label, which initially was known as Rockefeller Records. Rockefeller, get it?
Yeah.
And these days it's known as Rock Nation. But he has told people that it's the rock sign and it's supposed to be a diamond. And there's his mate Kanye West doing it. But it turns out to be a lot older than that. It's a symbol that's been around for a long time. It's been used by many cultures in different parts of the world. It's part of the Indian mudra system of sign language, amongst other uses. But here's Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan flashing up the same symbol. So it was around back then, certainly. And it's known as a triangle of manifestation in occult circles. And the idea is that you imbue this symbol with your will and your intent, and you bring together your thoughts, emotions, and actions, and empower it. And you can enable yourself to manifest any kind of situation that you wish to occur. So when you see Jay-Z doing it, you've got to wonder what the will and the intent is behind that symbol in that particular instance. And then the other one, which I touched on earlier, is the covering of one eye, depicting the all-seeing eye, the eye of Horus, you know, the eye in the illuminated capstone on the back of the dollar bill, and there are various other interpretations of it as well. But either way, it's another calling card and another little motif of these industries and of those that are calling the shots at the upper levels. This is a little section which I've put in this year because I'm starting to look at the genre of music that's known as EDM, electronic dance music. So it's basically music that you hear played in clubs all around the world. It's the most popular genre of music with young people. You hear it in every country, on every continent of the world. Absolutely massive. You know, it incorporates house music, trance, techno, and all these other expressions of EDM. I've done a lot of research into the signs and symbols and the calling cards that have been popping up in hip-hop and R&B and pop music over the past few years. So everyone from Britney Spears to Katy Perry to Miley Cyrus, Jay-Z, Beyonce, Rihanna, all these artists, the same signs and symbols have been cropping up in the videos of these artists for years. Lady Gaga's another one. And I've started to notice that the very same calling cards are now popping up in videos and record sleeves and stuff related to the electronic dance music scene. So it's pretty clear what's going on. They've done a number on hip-hop and on pop music generally over the past few years. Now they're turning their attentions towards EDM, big time, and they're starting to leave the same little clues and emblems in the works of this genre. This is a logo for military intelligence, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but so-called, MI5. So this is their logo, a pyramid with the corners cut out at the bottom of the pyramid, and then a capstone at the top with an eye in it. And this is a logo that's been used by the EDM producer and DJ and artist Paul van Dyk, German guy. He's been a phenomenally successful dance music producer and DJ for the past several years. And for the past few years, he's been using this interesting logo. And I was trying to figure out what it represented, because it's very enigmatic. But we can see what it is anyway. If you flip that symbol upside down so that you have the cut-out corners at the bottom, you can see that it resembles the logo for MI5 military intelligence quite closely. Why would that be? And then, if you want to chalk that up as a coincidence or just one of those things, we then find that the Japanese dance music producer and DJ, known as Steve Aoki, also employs the same logo. So again, we have the triangle with the two corners cut out at the bottom, and we have the capstone at the top with an eye in it. And I was discussing this with somebody at the weekend, a dance music fan from the Netherlands, and they told me that apparently Steve Aoki comes from a background in banking, a banking dynasty. That's his family profession. And you know, he seems to come from a bloodline which is deemed important to these individuals. Reminds me of Yoko Ono, actually, because when you get into the backstory of Yoko, she comes from a long-standing banking dynasty. She's said to be connected to the Emperor of Japan, so an aristocratic bloodline. And she spent some time in a mental institution as well, back in Japan. So is that mind control? Some interesting elements there. Anyway, on with the familiar symbolism that we're now seeing in this genre. Fedde Le Grand, Dutch dance music artist. Here he is with a pyramid covering his eye. Two symbols for the price of one. This is the group Foxes. So we have the 666 thing going on over the eye. This is a video from the group The Freemasons. Interesting name. Inside a church with an illuminated pyramid. Now, believe it or not, there is actually a dance music act that call themselves MK Ultra. So here's one of their images, and here's another one, a pyramid. And MK Ultra is not the name of a rave night in Milton Keynes, as I keep pointing out, though it could be. Nicky Romero video, two symbols for the price of one. There's the pyramid thing and the covering of the eye. All the same old tried and tested things that we've seen so many times before. This is the logo for Tomorrowland, which is a big dance music festival, takes place every year in Belgium. And we've got the all-seeing eye thing going on at the top of that logo as well. When we get into the names of a lot of these dance music festivals, much of it seems to hint at transhumanism, the transhumanist agenda. That's another aspect of what's being rolled out in this reality, which is very much tied into the music industry. You see it majorly in pop music and in so-called R&B and hip-hop, so why would you not expect to see it in dance music as well? But I've got a chapter in the book talking about the transhumanist agenda and the various elements of it that are being rolled out increasingly by the week, and how symbolism and imagery in music has been used to normalise this whole agenda in the subconscious minds of young people that are watching all this stuff. So they're placing elements of where they plan to take us and this very dark and dangerous road that transhumanism represents. And not only transhumanism in terms of merging humanity with technology and implants and microchips and stuff like that, but the whole way that society is changing towards electronic, digital ways of doing things, an absolute reliance on technology replacing, human input. So we're now getting things like smart cities, such as Glasgow, where the whole city grid is linked up to a whole bunch of computers. You've got all these appliances communicating with each other via RFID signals. And from what I hear, people are being surveilled and filmed as they walk down the streets in Glasgow now, and they have microphones rigged up in lampposts and stuff recording people's conversations. I have it on good authority that's already taking place. And the plan will obviously be to roll it out to other cities as time goes on. So all this stuff is really not good. And although we're entrained to think that technology improves our lives and is really good for us, and of course in many instances it is, and it can be, generally the idea of replacing human ways of doing things with technological electronic ways is not such a great thing, I would suggest. I'm old school in a lot of stuff that I do because I'm just not somebody that gets on with technology. So driving up here today, I had a paper map. I refer to an atlas, I don't do sat-nav. I'm just old-fashioned like that. But I'm quite untrusting of technology because I understand where they're trying to take us in so many ways. So it's certainly something for people to be familiar with and wary of, I would suggest. But they really are trying to normalise this aspect of society with stuff that's going into videos and stuff that's going into the naming of festivals like Tomorrowland, and there's Futurescape and Future World and all this sort of stuff, It's all aimed at the subconscious mind. It's all designed to be absorbed subliminally so that all this stuff, when it's rolled out in reality, is more readily accepted because there's a familiarity with it from the subconscious mind, from all the stuff that people have absorbed through popular culture. And just finally, truth in plain sight, how blatant do you want it? There's a long-standing record label coming from Eric Murillo, American producer, and for many years his label's been called Subliminal Recordings. And it's absolutely blatant, when you know what you're looking for. So we've got black and white sort of duality, polarity going on here, similar to what you get on the floors of Masonic temples, and hinting at the duality of light and dark and night and day and all that stuff. You've got the covering of one eye, you've got pyramids going on, and the whole thing is called subliminal. So, they're not even trying to hide it in some. Another aspect of the truth being hidden in sight. It's a very interesting one, and it's slightly different from the other aspects of how it's done. So we're getting into the realm of what's known as backmasking, subliminal messages encoded into audio recordings. This is a subject area that's been studied for decades, and for everyone that says there's stuff hidden in audio recordings, you can find a skeptic that will say, no, it's all a load of bollocks, none of it is real, you just hear what you want to hear. So one of the most famous tracks, which is said to incorporate a message which can only be understood when the audio is played backwards, is Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, iconic classic rock track. And there's supposed to be a line in it which, when you play the song in reverse, comes out as, "Here's to my sweet Satan," and other stuff related to Satan. So there's also a Madonna record, I've related this anecdote in previous talks, called Justify My Love, which contains a similar message related to Satan. And as I mentioned earlier, Madonna has for a long time been viewed as the high priestess of this industry. She served them very well, she's a key asset, so they keep her around and they keep her doing her work. And here she is way back in 1985 with her Illuminati pyramid jacket on the back. So this whole thing about backmasking, there's this guy in Australia by the name of David Oates. And in 1983, the story is that he accidentally dropped a tape machine into the toilet. And from that point on, it would only play backwards. And so he started playing these tapes and realised it was all coming out backwards, and he thought, the machine's screwed. But then after a while, he started to notice what he perceived to be messages encoded in this speech that could only be recognised when it was played backwards. And he's made this his specialist area of interest over the past 30 years. And he's established this whole area of study known as reverse speech therapy. And his idea, which has been taken up by another guy called John Kelly in Canada, who runs Your Inner Voice. The idea is that the truth of someone's situation and of their true nature and of what's really on their mind can actually be revealed in reverse in their speech. So you can be talking about something on an everyday basis, which is quite trivial in its natural form. But what this guy does is record long periods of people speaking and then play the tapes backwards and try and identify recognisable phrases which give a clue as to what's really going on in their psyche. So there's examples you can get of this. He appears on Jeff Rentz, on Rentz's show, and has done for the best part of 20 years, quite regularly. So there's shows in Rentz's archive where you can hear him playing examples of this stuff. And John Kelly has appeared on a Red Ice Radio interview where he plays some of these backwards tapes. So this is the idea that unwittingly and unknown to the conscious mind, you can actually be communicating stuff that's coming from the subconscious, and it's a form of inversion. So it only comes out in reverse. There's aspects of inversion everywhere in creation and duality and stuff. But this is, the opinion of Oates and John Kelly and other people that are into this reverse speech therapy stuff. So if this is the case, and if there is validity to it, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that when you get rock tracks with messages that only make sense when the audio is played in reverse, could this be a rendering of what is really on the musician's mind, what they're really all about, what they belong to, their true nature, coming through in the recording without their conscious knowledge of it? Because Led Zeppelin have consistently denied that they deliberately put a message in Stairway to Heaven. They said it's rubbish, this stuff doesn't happen. The Beatles put a whole load of stuff into their recordings in reverse, but they admitted to it. They would often say, John Lennon, particularly in interviews, has said, the Beatles' music is full of subliminal stuff. So much of it could be being done as a prank. But I would also suggest that there could be other elements of what's going on here. So I mention that as just another interesting aspect of what could be the truth of a situation being put in plain sight, but only those with the eyes or ears to recognise it are going to really know what's going on. I just added these the other day. The true nature of artists. And I touched earlier on the fact that if you're up there as a prominent celebrity, you will have basically sold your soul for fame and fortune. And people think that's a metaphor, but I think there's a very real sense in which people do that. They sign a contract, and from that point, their arse is owned by the corporations. Yes, they become millionaires, they get the yacht, they get the Bentley, they get the mansion, but their life is never really their own from that point on. And there's probably a sense in which their soul and their humanity is not their own from that point on. And of course, the higher the earnings of a celebrity, the more they will have been bending over for those that control them. So, for many years, Oasis, Liam Gallagher, and Noel were seen as these rebellious kind of, rock icons. They were cool, and they weren't down with the establishment, man. They were just, part of the alternative. But, we've all seen images of Noel hobnobbing with Tony Blair back in '97 when the Labour Party first got in. And there was an article the other day where Noel was apparently still praising Tony Blair, even with all the stuff we now know about him, being a psychopathic war criminal and cross-dresser. He's still bigging up Tony Blair. So are those his true feelings, or is he just sticking to the script and keeping up his part of the deal that he would have made a long time ago? How can anyone still be supporting Tony Blair and saying he's a great guy and, you admire his work? Come on now. And then get all these artists that have been taking awards in Betty's Noncing Club. aka OBEs, MBEs, knighthoods. Goldie, I mean, come on. Goldie again was supposed to be this edgy, dangerous kind of, alternative artist, and he's taken a bloody OBE. Why would you do that? And Damon Albarn of Blur took an MBE this year. A few years ago he was speaking out about, I think he made comments about 9/11, and he's spoken out about homelessness, and he's been quite critical of various aspects of the government. Next thing you know, he's taken a bloody knighthood. So, is this a way of just neutering these artists into obedience and shutting them up, or just reminding them what they're a part of and the nature of the contract that they would have signed? It's so disappointing when you see these figures taking knighthoods from an institution that's all about slavery and paedophilia and, depraved activity. So we're getting into the reasons why I believe all this stuff is done. Why do they place the truth of a matter in plain sight? Why do they do predictive programming? Why do they put signs and symbols out there that enable you to know what they're all about and what they're doing? Admittedly, the majority of people have no idea what these things mean. It goes straight over their heads, or it goes into their subconscious mind and they have no idea that it's there. And there's only a small proportion of people that will be seeing all this stuff that would properly understand what it all means. But nevertheless, they're putting it out there and they're giving people the opportunity to know. And the reason why I feel they're doing it comes down to free will consciousness, consent, and natural law. So we're back to Savile, and he came out on an interview a few years ago wearing this sweatshirt which says, "I am an animal and I will eat you if I have to." So the host of the show, which I think was Sir, there's another one, David Frost, and Sir Jimmy Savile, says, "What's this on your shirt, Jimmy?" And with his usual bluster and bullshit, he says, "You must give them all fair warning, you see." And this is the concept that he's trying to convey. Fair warning, he would know how this dynamic works. The powers that shouldn't be and the controllers of these institutions and everything else place the truth in plain sight because they feel that when they've communicated to us what they're all about and what they plan to do, they've then put the onus of the situation onto us, and they've gained our tacit approval and our unspoken consent for it through the free will consciousness that we are gifted with. We have the opportunity to make decisions for ourselves through free will, and we get karmic consequences coming back at us according to the choices that we make through our free will consciousness. Now, I believe that these controllers understand how this dynamic works, and they also understand this one, natural law, which goes by many other names, spiritual law, universal law. It can be broken down very simply into do no harm, but take no shit. So the do no harm is the important bit, and it should really be a worldwide mantra, and it should be taught to kids in schools, I feel. You can expand it to do not treat others in a way you would not wish to be treated yourself. I can't imagine anyone with their humanity intact objecting to that teaching being taught to kids from a very young age. If you don't want a certain thing to happen to you, don't do it to other people. Very, very simple, very straightforward. And actually, this teaching lies at the root of pretty much all the major organised religions of the world. All the dogma and all the rules and religions and all the teachings of the various holy books have been piled onto it. But at the core of all these religions lies this teaching, basically, do no harm. You're not supposed to, undertake behaviours that impact negatively on others. So I believe the controllers understand that this dynamic is at play in the universe, in creation, and that we're all bound by it. And that the karma that you reap as a result of whether you choose to live in accordance with this truth or not, varies. They feel that by communicating what they're all about and what they plan to do, when we don't voice any kind of objection to it, and when we just absorb it and go about our business, they've removed the burden from themselves and placed it on us. And because we've not said no To them, that's as good as us saying yes. And as far as they're concerned, they've done no harm. Now they feel they do not stand to reap any negative karmic consequences from what they're doing because we're okay with it. It is a sick, twisted, distorted way of looking at it. I would suggest that they've misunderstood how this dynamic works. I've made the point before that these people are mentally ill, they're not well, they are psychopaths, and so it's understandable that they would see things in a twisted, distorted way. But nevertheless, something has to account for why they spend so much time, trouble, and energy doing all this stuff, all these signs and symbols, all this encoding, all this predictive programming. And I believe that at the root of it all lies this: undue influence and consent. That's what's really going on. So at the conference that I was at the weekend, I only had 15 minutes to speak, and you can't really convey much of this stuff in 15 minutes. And the focus of the talks from all the speakers was supposed to be about empowering solutions. So specifically, the conference organisers didn't want to dwell on problems that we face. They just wanted the speakers to suggest ways out of it and how do we take our power back and how do we, improve the situation. So I don't often refer to notes, but I did make some notes for this one because I wanted to make sure I stayed on track with it and didn't forget anything. So I wrote down 5 points that I wanted to put across at the tail end of all this information. So when it comes to practical solutions to all these problems that we can understand, the first one is quite a real world one, and it's simply to be more discerning. I would love people, and particularly young people, to make more discerning choices in terms of music that they listen to and artists they choose to support, because you find, particularly young people now, they will just go with whatever music is served up for them on the radio or whatever videos come on MTV or whatever stuff they hear in clubs, and there's no searching beyond that for anything else that might lie out there. And I know from personal experience that there is a whole load of great, conscious, meaningful music still being made by artists today that really resonates and really expresses so many of these things that we discussed, that you hear discussed at meetings such as this, and music that is really made with a positive intent and with a great vibrational frequency that just makes you feel good and uplifts the spirit. This stuff is out there, but people are missing it because they're just taking all the toxic crap that is served up by the mainstream radio stations and videos. And whenever they decide they want a new puppet or a new stooge to push up to the top of the game, the kids just lap it up straight away. They're like, oh, this is the new rapper, is it? Okay, yeah, I'll support him, because I've been told he's good. So there's no discernment going on. And I think if people were more discerning and dug out some of this more conscious music and didn't focus so much on all the controlled puppets, it would send a message back to the controllers that, perhaps the plan's not working as well as they had hoped it would, and people are actually starting to think for themselves. That's just one, practical solution and suggestion. Because if nobody supported these artists and agendas, what would be the next move then when you break the mind control? So the second one, as I just expressed, is the fact that their entire control system is relying upon our tacit approval and unspoken consent. And I feel we have to make it clear at every opportunity that we do not consent to what's being done to us, and to make a very clear statement. This is the reason for placing the truth in plain sight at every turn. So there'll be, practical ways that you can express the fact that you do not consent to things. Voting, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I know we've got the forms going around tonight asking about the Brexit vote and stuff, but I wonder what would happen if huge, vast swathes of the population just didn't bother to vote. And, you get something like 3% of the population that actually bothered to turn out to the polls. I wonder if that would send a message back to the controllers that people are starting to see through the bullshit and the corruption of the political system. They understand that it's compromised. They understand that it's not working in their favour. If 97% of the population stayed home on polling day, I wonder if that would send a message that, you know, we're starting to see through all the lies. That's just one option. Another one is smart meters. You know, we've got this agenda now where they're trying to roll out smart meters everywhere. And for as long as people just accept it, then they're going to get what they want. If people's electricity companies just say, oh, we're coming around next week to install a smart meter, and the vast majority of people are like, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough, if that's what you want to do, then they get this network that they want. But what would happen if the bulk of the population, huge numbers of people, understanding that smart meters are not a great idea, they're not good for human health, they're not good for anything, they're connected with surveillance and, you know, this trans-humanist thing that I was talking about earlier. What would happen if large numbers of people said, we're not having a smart meter, what are you going to do about it? And,
They've
you know,
putting information around about them
right.
to stop them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know who they wheeled out last year as the public face of smart meters to try and push the whole thing?
It was, you mean the bands?
No, that's celebrity.
Oh no, go on.
Bob Geldof. Sorry, Sir.
There's a surprise.
Sir Bob Geldof.
Yeah.
So Sir Bob Geldof has been standing up there saying, get smart meters, folks. Then that's what we need to do. You know, large numbers of people get you know, I was going to say smart. The smartest thing about anything with smart in the front of it is to give it the widest berth possible. But people need to, you know, get clued up on what smart meters are really all about and just say, no, we're not having it. So that's just one example of what can be done. And then, as I pointed out, the controllers are observing the tenets of natural law, and we need to be doing that as well. Everyone needs to be observing that golden rule. Do no harm. Do not treat others in a way you'd not wish to be treated yourself. Because if you had large numbers of people, or the majority of a population, observing that golden rule of do no harm, everyone's situation improves. Because everyone is going to be considering whether an action they're about to undertake is going to impact negatively on someone else, or is going to take away their rights. And if it is, they don't do it on the grounds that they wouldn't appreciate it if somebody did that to them. If that basic teaching was understood and absorbed and practiced by the majority of people in a population, everyone's experience improves. You know, that's why this stuff should be taught to kids, seriously. But it's not. And then to become symbol literate, I think it would be great if, and one of the reasons why I do these talks is because I want to convey how this symbolism is being used and get people to recognise some of this stuff that they see all their pop stars doing, and to become symbol literate, to understand what they mean and get them out of the subconscious mind where they just get readily absorbed and into the conscious mind. And as I said, when you learn to spot these signs and symbols, the minute you see one being deployed, you notice it straight away. And it's no longer having that magic effect, that spell on you, once you learn to understand what it is. So I'm trying to get a lot of people, particularly young people, because I've found that when you talk to teenagers or, you know, young people generally about this music game, this is a subject that they love, particularly when you dangle a little carrot in front of them and you say, Jay-Z, Beyonce, Kanye West, yeah, you know. They want to know more. If you mention there's stuff in a Kanye West video that is, you know, you're not supposed to know about, most young people are going to want to know more. So it's a great way of bringing them in at entry level to this whole arena of information and saying, well, yeah, this is going on, and this is why, and these are some of the symbols that you need to be aware of. And then, you know, they're going to talk to their friends about it, and the awareness is going to grow, and the magic spell is going to get broken, because we're being mind controlled on a mass basis. But the mind control stops when you recognise the tricks that are being used against you. And then the way out of this insanity, I would suggest, lies in consciousness, ultimately. Just raising your vibrational frequency, accessing higher levels of consciousness, and overwriting the current version of reality that we have with a better version of it. Because I tell you, the forces that are controlling everything, basically, that are enslaving us spiritually as well as physically and mentally, understand all this stuff. They understand the nature of reality, they understand how the universe works, and they're using it, they're putting it into action And we need to be doing that as well. We need to understand these dynamics, because you hear so many times that frequencies and levels of consciousness that are rooted in positive intent and love are so many times more powerful than the dark, low-density, fear-based stuff. And they can overwrite it 1,000 times over. So a significant proportion of the population raising their consciousness in this way and just focusing their intent on more positive outcomes can have some very real effects in terms of what manifests. And this is where we get to a phrase from Aleister Crowley, where he spoke of magic with a K being the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So you can actually bring about a physical situation which everyone experiences if you know what you're doing with your will and your intent, and if you focus it strongly enough on what you wish to manifest. That is what these dark occultists are doing with all their rituals and all their various activities all the time to keep us locked into this fear-based state that we all live in. And this can all change any time that enough of us want it, and any time that enough of us understand this dynamic and how it works, because he's absolutely right. We've just got to take their knowledge and their tricks and bring it into our usage and overwrite their version of reality with one that we actually want to experience. This process can happen anytime enough of us want it, so it can happen tomorrow morning if there's enough people on board with it. And any one individual can be an essential component in it. You don't need letters after your name, you don't need any special training, doesn't matter who you are, what walk of life you come from. Any human soul with the capacity for consciousness can be an essential part in the process that needs to take place. So I always end on this one because I love it. If not now, then when? And if not you, then who? You know, right now is as good as any other time. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to put across. As I say, there's much, much more in the book. I think I've only got 2 copies now, but if anyone does want to grab one, I can do you a copy by post. If you can pay by PayPal, just come and see me at the table. I'm happy to do questions, but I think I'd prefer to do it on an individual basis over at the table if anyone wants to come up and ask them, rather than over the mic. So I hope all that made sense. Thank you for listening, and great, thanks.
Excellent, that, Mark. Excellent. Mark Devlin, excellent.